welcome to another historical story about Wookey Hole. Today we're talking about the building behind me, the paper mill. The building behind me was built by William Sampson Hodgkinson, and it dates mainly from the 1850s. Now, in terms of Wookey Hole, it has a river coming out the caves. For that reason, there have been mills here before. There were paper mills, there were corn mills, and fulling mills going back to 1085, back to Doomsday. Now, the mill here today used to be a mill that made cotton paper. The cotton came from clothing, and it was mixed with the water that came from the caves, okay? And today we're going to look at the process of how they used to make paper here, going way back to the 1850s. Okay, so the first process was getting the cotton into the mill. Deliveries by horse and cart were from the surrounding areas, and in fact one chap called Tom Vincent, he worked 47 years delivering cotton from Wales on something just like the one next to me here, horse and cart. Now the cotton was old clothing, so old clothing was brought in. Also cotton from shirt manufacturers. There was a manufacturer of shirts in Taunton, and they would bring in the offcuts from those shirts into the mill, also to be used for the papermaking process. So the second part of the process was actually cutting the rags up. So once the rags were delivered by horse and cart, they were then taken to a room called the cutting room. In the cutting room, as you can see here, these are original from the days of the mill, a table with a knife in the centre. Cotton pieces were literally cut with a knife into small pieces, and those small pieces were then thrown into baskets, and the baskets would be filled, taken to the boiler for the next part of the process. So the rag pieces were coming from this room. This is where the cutting room is. The baskets were brought in and they were emptied into the boiler. Now this boiler originated actually from a lead mine works about 3 miles from here. It was brought down by 13 horses off the top of the Mendip Hills to here in 1883 as their new boiler for papermaking. Now the rag pieces were put into the boiler along with caustic soda and lime. The caustic soda and lime was there to start cleaning the rags, to start the breaking down process. And after the night in the boiler, the next part was then to wash it with water to clear off the caustic soda and lime. And in here, in this building, we still have this original boiler just over here in front of me in the corner. Okay, so the next part of the process was getting the rag pieces from the boiler to the room where the breakers are. So what they used were little boxes on wheels. They're called dollies, and the dolly would be filled with this wet rag mixture, brought across the floor I'm standing on, and then in behind here we have the lift. This is a hydraulic lift working off the water that comes again out of the caves behind me. So the dolly was taken up here, and then from the floor above, that box will be then dragged by someone through to the room where the breakers were for the next part of the process. Okay, so next part of the process, here we go. This is one of the dollies I mentioned. So these ones dragged in from the room, the boiler room next door. From here, they were emptied. The cotton pieces were put into this, which is called a breaker. And the breaker has 2 parts to it. Now you have to imagine this had a wooden cover over the top, and in between these bars here, we've had bronze bars connected by, or wedged by pieces of wood. Now this would be lowered, and what you had was the cotton and the water in the bottom of the breaker, and this would start to rotate. And as it rotated, they would lower it further and further, and the idea was it was pulling the cotton. It wasn't cutting it, or it was literally just pulling it to make lots of fibrous ends so that paper would stick together when it was used for paper later. This part over here, this was a drum that collected waste or dirt from the mixture. So any dirt in the water, that kind of thing, would be trapped by this gauze here. But yeah, this is the breaker. It was in here for maybe a couple of hours, and from this one, it was pumped to a machine called a beater. The beater does much the same, but it gets it down to a smaller level. This is the beater, and so from behind the wall over here on the left, the rag pieces and water from the breaker were then literally emptied into this one here. Now, much like the breaker, beneath this wooden cover here is a drum with bars that rotate and can be lowered to break that cotton into smaller and smaller pieces. Now, the person that operated one of these was also one of the most skilled parts of the process, because they had to know how long the mixture had been in this thing, because that would affect the length of fibre. which also was important in types of different paper. So they also needed to know what paper they were going to make the next day to ensure they had fibres of the correct length. Now the cotton and water also with something called size, and size often in those days came from animal bones. So when the rags were delivered, you had a rag and bone man, the bones were here to make size. The size was in the mixture also because that would stop the ink from running on the paper once the paper was written on. So you had, as I say, the cotton, the water, the size in here for up to a few hours at a time. Okay, so from the beater next door, the cotton and water mixture, which happens to be known as stuff, was emptied into this tank here on my right. This big thing over here is called a stuff chest. There is a beam which is rotated to keep that mixture mixed all the time. And the person standing where I am now would have been called a vat man. The vat man was the most skilled person in the mill. They actually trained for 7 years to become a vat man because they were also very skilled. They had the best pay in the mill and apparently also the best houses. There were houses in the village built by the mill owner and they had first choice. Now the vat man would dip these things. This is a decal and a mould into the vat and catch an amount of cotton on here. And that's where the skill came, because they knew exactly how much was sitting, how thick the cotton was on this mould to ensure the right weight of paper was being made for that day. And the next part, they would pass this along here to another person who was standing the other side of this grey panel here. And they were known as the coucher. Okay, so you had the vat man and the coucher. And coucher, we believe, comes from the French coucher, to lie down, because what they were doing is they were lying down pieces of paper onto blankets. The coucher would literally roll the mould over onto a blanket, sticking the paper sheet onto that one and continue that whole process. Okay, so this is a demonstration of how that paper was made. In here is the cotton fibres and water. As you can see, it's tend to sink to the bottom, so it needs to be mixed. So I'm just going to turn the machine on to mix it up. Okay, so yeah, the vat man was the person to put the mould in. So here we have this, which is called a decal, and this the mould. The mould really is like a very fine metal wire on a wooden frame. Two go together, and the vat man dips it into the tank to catch the first piece of cotton. Now this was a very skilled part. As I say, the vat man trained for 7 years to become a vat man. It's about getting those fibres really knotted together so the paper doesn't really fall apart. There's no glue involved in here, it's just the size that's put in the mixture. The final shake is known as closing the sheet, and then the mould will be taken off from the decal. Now the next part of the process would be that this mould will be passed to the coucher, and the coucher, taking the mould, will then stick the paper sheet onto a felt. Okay, so literally rolling it down and then rocking it from side to side a few times, and to lift a slightly bigger lift at the end just to take the mould off of the paper. Now the whole process would be another blanket on top, another piece of paper, until about 100 sheets high. Okay, that whole thing was pressed, and when it's pressed, it means the water is less in this paper, meaning you can actually separate the paper from the blankets. Now, this isn't what they would have done, but just to give you some idea, if I roll this here, and as I say, this isn't part of the process that they used to do here at Wookey Hole, it's just to kind of show you how the effect of losing water affects the paper. Okay, so if I unravel this now, it might just show you how, in effect, the paper could be separated, because once the paper had been in the press for maybe about 15-20 minutes, the coucher and vat man would come back and separate those papers from the blankets. So just to show you here, look, it probably won't come as one piece, it might do, but that's kind of to give you the idea of how the actual paper separated from the blankets. Okay, so this couching process would continue to about a height of about here, so about 100 sheets of paper and blankets, and then, once that had been completed, the coucher and the vat man, using metal rods like these here, would actually physically drag this whole thing across these like rail lines here into the hydraulic press. Now the press will be lowered, it will be left in there for anything between, I think, 15 to 20 minutes, squeezing out the water. And at the point they felt it was ready, again, using these, they would actually physically drag this back out. It would turn, and then between the Kucher and the vatman, they would separate one sheet of paper from a blanket, going all the way down till they had a pile of papers on one side and a pile of blankets on the other. Okay, so from this room, the Kucher and the vatman, their paper sheets were taken to what's called a drying loft. The drying lofts in this mill today were on the upper floor, and what you had was a series of ropes running from the top of the building to the floor, not just as the one you can see here. And the ropes, they had to be made of cow hair. Any other type of hair wouldn't work. Cow hair didn't leave marks in the paper. And they would lie maybe 3 to 5 sheets over the ropes. The room wasn't heated, but there was a background heat, and those papers were left to dry naturally for, let's say, 3 to 5 days. After that, the final process. Okay, so once the paper had been dried on the upper floor of the mill here, what would then happen is the paper would either be glazed, which is actually putting paper sheets like this one here between metal sheets that were then sent backwards and forwards between rollers to really polish off the surface to get a very, very smooth finish. The other thing they could do was to actually cut it. So most people back in those days, actually the rougher edge left by the decal was considered to be the better option, and this is known as a decal edge. But if it was to be cut, as I say, they would use a guillotine like this to cut those pieces of paper up, and that room was called the finishing room. That's where papers were finished and packaged before being sent out across the country and across the world. Okay, so the big difference about cotton paper is how long it lasts. Cotton paper will last 500 years. Paper that we use today made of wood is about 100. So even today and back in those days as well, the same thing. Legal papers were often printed on cotton paper because you wanted those documents to be there for hundreds of years in the future. Now this one, over here on my right, this was one that was made back in 1997 for Her Majesty the Queen's Golden Wedding, and this paper here made at Wookey Hole and printed obviously for that purpose. But apart from things like this, as I say, it was banknotes, paper sent across the country, across the world, and used again for printing banknotes.